Here's the knee. So we know where the knee is located, right? The lower, like what we call the shin bone, it's called the fibula. And then the thigh bone is the femur bone. And so the knee joint is where these two bones come together. And then it's protected by the kneecap, which is called the patella. So what you see, it's held together just by these ligaments here. There goes ligaments to the side that hold the top bone and the bottom bone together, and then there's ligaments that go across. But you can see, so this knee is straight, and you can see these ligaments that hold it together. You can probably imagine that also how that works. But if the knee is straight, these ligaments are taut to keep it in a straight position, right? The ligaments are taut. When I bend the knee, the ligaments become lax, right? It's kind of like a little hammock kind of thing. Or think about an elastic band, right? Like if you have an elastic band on two sticks, right? And you put the sticks in the straight position, but if you then put it like this, then the elastic band is gonna be a little bit hanging, dangly. So from that perspective, and the knee itself doesn't have any muscles, right? It just has those few ligaments holding the different bones together. The only muscles, that's why we keep saying to strengthen the knee, you need to strengthen the muscles around it, so the rest of your leg. But the knee itself is just those bones and the ligaments. And so when the leg is in a straight position, the ligaments are taut, and so its internal mechanism is by itself automatically, it's the most protected. When the knee is bent, that internal mechanism, there's less protection in the knee. So it's a little bit more vulnerable when the knee is bent. Does that make sense? Also, when the leg is straight, it's a little bit more easier to tap into to those muscles around it and contract the muscles. When the knee is bent, that's, it's different, but that seems to be a little harder. So from that perspective, the knee in itself seems to be the most safe when it's in a straight position. But now, what is straight? There's straight and there's straight. So let's talk a little bit about that concept of knee. So what are people afraid of? Why would a lot of non-Bikram yogis tell you to not have your leg completely straight, but a micro bend in the knee? Why is there so much fear around a straight knee?
The knee going past the straight?
Past straight, right? Do you know what we would call that?
Hyperextension. Hyperextension.
So for a lot of people, that depends on everybody's flexibility to what degree that happens. But hyperextension, so if this is straight, hyperextension would be that you kind of push beyond that. So depending from person to person, but some people, the leg bows out even behind. I'll show you some postures of standing bow after it. Standing bow is also very common. Standing head to knee and standing bow. So when the leg is hyperextended, bring it in a place where the bones are kind of probing on each other, rather than the muscular engagement, the contraction of the muscles around it, holding it in place. And that you can imagine that for some people, it depends a little bit the degree of all of which that's working. But for a lot of people, over time, again, it's not that hyperextending your knees once or twice, it's going to damage your knee, but it's that repetition over time. And it depends what else with your body are you doing while your knee's hyperextended. So that is the concern that people have with that concept of lock the knee, straight leg, knee locked. And that's why in all other traditions, there would be a notion of a micro bend in the knee. So two things I want to say about that. So first, micro bend in the knee. Very often we don't really know what micro means. And when people hear micro bend, what I see happen is that people just have a bent knee. And this is not micro bend, this is bent. So that whole dynamic that I was just talking about, the ligaments are not taught here, is the case here. So it's really difficult to figure out, like, where is that, right? It could be a lot of different things. So we'll look at that a little bit more. Now, let's go back to that concept of locking the knee a little bit, and where I think that's coming from, and what I believe, is meant by that. Or I don't use the word, I don't use the concept, because I think it's so confusing, and when I teach, I like to change a little bit the patterns that people have been, hearing. So I don't say it, but if I would say it, I know what I would mean by that. But here's the thing with the concept, lock the knee. First of all, in Bikram's dialogue, it doesn't say lock the knee, not in this posture. It says knee locked. What is the difference between that? What's the difference between lock the knee and knee locked? And you might say to me, hey, Zefia, you're a little bit nitpicky on language right now. We're not doing an English course here. I thought we were just talking about the body. Is it really such a big deal? I think it's a little different in concept.
Is one where we often talk about lock the knee, is in the third part of is in standing in half moon, where you're bending forward and you're trying to lock the knees when you've got your belly on, and you're saying lock your knees, because you're trying to convey to the students that they need to straighten their legs. Whereas when you're saying locked knee, you're talking about a straight leg, and it has to be straight before they can actually go any further into the pose.
So I think you're kind of getting there where I think the difference is. But lock the knee is a direction, is a straight up action. Knee locked is a result, is kind of a description of what it should feel like. Right? You contract your muscles in your leg. As a result, the knee is in a locked position. Lock the knee is an action. And I think that's a big difference, because if we keep hearing lock the knee in this posture, we associate that with the action of jamming the knee back. But if we could potentially hear knee locked, if we describe all the actions that get you there, then knee locked in a locked position is kind of what the result of doing everything else right. Right, like what you might have heard from Bikram teachers, how Bikram talks about that. Your leg is like a lamppost. It's almost like you don't have the knee. Right? Have you heard that? Because there's everything else is so super contracted and engaged. Now, also, I lately have not really come very often in the defense of Bikram, but here I do, with that concept of locking the knee, surprisingly, because again, it's not something that I teach, but here is what I think where it comes from. Remember, we were talking about bandhas the other day?
Yeah.
We talked about awkward. And we said bandhas in yoga is a very common concept. It's an energy lock where you would contract or certain areas in the body, so that there's no energy exchange, right? So if you think about the throat, I gave that example. You breathe in, you kind of like have that swallowing sensation. You can't inhale, you can't exhale, and then you release. So most of the times you hear being talked about bandhas as energy locks. And the most common locks that we hear of is the three that I mentioned the other day: the pelvic floor lock, the solar plexus lock, and the throat lock. But there's another way that is also being talked about bandhas, and it's much more from a physical perspective. And in that perspective, it's a co-activation of different muscle groups around a joint to stabilize the joint. So that sounds familiar to what we're talking about right now, right? I'll give you, and so if you think about that, there's many more bandhas than just the common bandhas, or the bandhas that we most commonly hear about in class. From that perspective, the pelvic floor lock is not so much some kind of vague energy lock having to do with the root chakra. It's the actual activation of the different muscle groups. And if you would come from a joint perspective, we would then see the sacrum as a joint, the lowest part of your spine. So let me show you what that would lead to. In traditional Hatha Yoga, a bandha, from the Sanskrit meaning to bind or lock, is described as a subtle internal energy lock or grip. Bandhas are said to be used to control and guide the energy gathered and generated by the internal body pressures created during Hatha Yoga via the postures, the muscles, and the breath. On a more physical level, a bandha is the co-activation of opposing muscles around a joint complex that helps stabilize, strengthen, and energize that joint complex. In most of the texts on yoga, only 3 main bandhas are described. These bandhas are intimately connected with the strength and stability of the lumbosacral spinal joint complex of the lower back. So that's the Mula Bandha, would be, as I said, like this near sacrum. The thoracic spine joint complex of the upper back, which is often called the solar plexus, that's the Uddiyana Bandha. And the cervical spine joint complex, which is mostly called the throat complex or the throat bandha. But here, if you think about more from a joint or bony perspective, it would be the joint complex of the neck, and that is Jalandhara bandha. The concept that bandhas are co-activations of opposing muscles can be extended to the major joints of the upper and lower limbs. Co-activation of opposing muscles around joint complexes, bandha, provides the strength and stability to safely perform advanced yoga postures and to assist the flow of energy throughout the body. So if from that perspective, then, there are 9 bandhas. Kulpa bandha, the ankle joint. Janu bandha, knee joint. Janu, sounds familiar, the word Janu? It's in the name, yeah, Janu Shirasana. Dandayamana Janu Shirasana. So Janu is knee. Kati bandha, hip joint complex. Mula bandha, lower lumbar spine joint complex. Uddiyana bandha, chest and thoracic spine joint complex. Jalandhara bandha, cervical spine joint complex. Amsa bandha, shoulder joint complex. Kupara bandha, elbow joint. And mani sounds like a familiar word too, right? Maybe it's some Sanskrit words are very close to the base of our language, foundation for our language. Manicure, main in French. Mani, hand. Mani bandha, wrist joint complex. So, having said all that, our knee joint, right, Janu bandha. So, if we think about knee locked, I personally just think that Bikram tried to explain a bandha to us for the knee joint complex without using the term bandha, and just came to the translation of your knee is locked in a locked position, that it's that energetic and the co-activation of all the muscles around the knee. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. So, but just like with everything, then it starts to go in a specific direction, which has sometimes maybe unwanted consequences.